Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just still letting people in, so I'm probably going to be a bit staccato in my introduction, but afternoon to you all. My name is Matt Bland. I'm Chief Operating Officer of the Society of Evidence-Based Policing. And this, hopefully, you know that you signed up to the Easier Said Than Done webinar series, which is all about trying to talk about the practicalities of introducing evidence-based ideas. They're evidence-based in different ways. And today we've got one that's not necessarily a particular intervention. This is talking more about the evidence and the applicability to policing, or not, as it may be, around school exclusions, the role of the police, and links to violence. This is very much sort of an informal type nature of discussion. So I'll be talking to Professor Alex Sutherland and Simon Rotherham, Superintendent Simon Rotherham of the Metropolitan Police Service, who I will get to introduce themselves in full in just a moment. Just to remind you on the format of this, no pre-reads have gone out. We will circulate something after the event, which will sort of distill the nature of the conversation we're having this afternoon. And we've got a bit of a bonus material in form of some briefing that Professor Sutherland has prepared for us. But as well as me having a chat and putting some questions to the panelists, there's very much the opportunity for you to do the same, I hope. So hopefully you can use the chat. If somebody wants to chuck a test question in there, just to let me know you can, that'd be great. This is the first time we're using Teams for this process. So this is a little bit of a test, a little bit of an experiment of our own this afternoon. Okay, let's meet the two panelists. Thank you, Suzanne. That's very kind of you. Simon, can I ask you to go first, and then I'll come to you, Alex, just by way of introduction, please.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you, Matt. And good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for inviting me along. So as Matt said, I'm Simon Rotherham. My day job is in the Met Police, but I'm here today as in my role as the Deputy Lead for the Children and Young Persons portfolio in the National Police Chiefs Council. Just in case those you may not know, National Police Chiefs Council is a sort of collaborative body of all the police chiefs. We can't tell anybody to do anything. It's not for us to set, we have no ability to order people to do things, but what we do is we nudge, we sort of cajole and hopefully influence. And a real key bit to that cajoling influence is evidence-based, and that's obviously where Professor Sutherland and Dr. Blank come in. Is they give us that real evidence of which we can then say to forces, this is the way that you should be doing your business. So our portfolio is children and young persons, which is a sort of an odd portfolio because clearly children and young people are involved in every aspect of policing. We don't involve ourselves in every aspect of policing. So there's, for example, it could be hate crime. Children are victims of hate crime, but we don't own hate crime. We try to influence the owners of hate crime to make sure that when they do children-centric activity, it's delivered in a children-centered way. But there are some key bits we do own, and one of them is schools. So we are responsible for that relationship between police and schools and the Department of Education. So today is really relevant for me, and I would be really interested to hear what people have to say around what they think the role of police in schools are. Another distinction I just want to just quickly make out really is around some of the terminology we use. So we call ourselves the Children and Young Person portfolio. Children we define as under 18, and we also moved away from phrases like youth, minors, and phrases like that. They're children. They're under 18, and we're really clear that you should call them children. Young persons, we are saying at 18 to 24, because there is a growing band of evidence to show around that maturity piece that people 18 to 24, there's a cliff edge around support and other things. So children under 18, young persons 18 to 24. And I know we're here to talk about particularly more around exclusions, but from our portfolio point of view, we're also interested in that wider absence from school piece. So we published our strategy a couple of years back, and there's a key line in there around our stated intent is that the best place for children is in education. So that's exclusions, that's suspensions, but that's also homeschooling and other areas where people can fall off the radar, and particularly around truant and absences. So that's just that whole sort of being absent from the education sector that is a concern for us. So really looking forward to today, and hopefully we can come up with some good ideas for us to take forward as a portfolio. So thank you, Matt.
Thanks very much, Simon. Alex or Professor Sutherland? Which one am I going with this afternoon?
Alex is fine, mate.
Go for it.
Hi everyone. So Alex Sutherland. I have a couple of different roles. I part-time at the University of Oxford as a professor in practice in criminology and public policy, and I also have a part-time advisory role to the Met Police, working with Simon and others, and I have a few other bits as well for different government departments. My relationship to kind of the work on exclusions, I've been working on the topic for about 10, 15 years or so. Because it's a strange topic in that it's kind of between different areas of policy. It's between justice and it's between education, and importantly, it's seen as a key risk factor, or has been seen as a key risk factor for crime, young people's crime, for many years. And so I've been involved in projects that have tested out interventions to reduce exclusion. I've been involved in systematic reviews of evidence around how to reduce exclusion, and in general, kind of I'm quite interested in the policy area, and also thinking, what can we do to test things out and understand how to prevent exclusion and to understand the problem. Really, that's kind of part of the main reason for being more interested over time. Is this is quite a complicated problem in some ways, and it's useful to think about how to try and solve it from different perspectives. I think that'll probably do.
Yes, great. That's brilliant. Thank you very much. Alex, can I come to you first then, just to cover off some basic definitions so we're all singing from the same hymn sheet in terms of what's an exclusion, what's a suspension, so on and so forth, in terms of engagement, please.
No problem. Yeah, so suspension and exclusion are different things. Unhelpfully or helpfully, the Department for Education terminology has changed. Suspensions, which is what it used to be when I was at school, which is a long time ago, were changed to fixed term exclusions for a bit, but now the language is back to what it was. So suspension is again, apologies to those who already know this, a temporary kind of sending away from school to the home, and it can be a fixed number of days. It's typically up to 5 days maximum at any one time because of something called the 6-day rule. Which if you go beyond 5 days, then the school have to kind of find alternative, the local authority and the school have to find alternative education provision for that child. Children can be suspended for up to 45 days in a single school year, which is quite a lot of time in a school year. When children are suspended, the parents are legally responsible for the supervision when they're in public spaces. So and in general for their supervision anyway, as you might imagine. Exclusion is different because it's a permanent sending away from a given school, and the local authority have to find another school by the 6th day. Whether they do or not varies, and I don't know the kind of stats on that, but those are the two main, main distinctions. There's also other things, just very quickly, there's other things called alternative provision and managed moves, but they're slightly different. AP is kind of outside of mainstream education, but there is a push to make it more mainstream, and managed moves are like as it suggests, like a transfer between schools that aren't the result of exclusion, but are seen as like a precursor to, or in some cases, a substitution for it.
That's cool. Okay, that's cool. So Simon, from National Police Chiefs Council perspective, national portfolio, how does that interplay with prevention work or with policing? And is that different? Is that, like many things, patchwork quilt across the country? Are there a different set of definitions that police are working to? What's the current lay of the land there?
Yeah, I mean, from a definitions point of view, obviously we work with the DFE one, so there is consistency around that. What policing does around these is absolutely localized, and in fact it's even more localized in amongst forces as well. So you will find some examples where, due to the relationship with that particular school, that the activities that policing will even do in a force area will be very different, and again mainly due to the attitude or the relationship with the head and the officer involved. So it's absolutely a variance in behaviours and in practice across the country. From a central policy point of view, we don't have one. We'd have no direction or policy around what policing does with people who are excluded or suspended. There was a recent discussion with government around what is the role in policing and truancy. Those who are as old as me will remember that at one point police used to go around in vans and sort of round up truants who were in the shopping centres and forcibly take them back to school. So there has been a shift in how policing is viewed in that absence from school space. But it also is challenged in certainly the last sort of year or two around some of the decisions that forces have taken, understandably, around reducing or scaling back their presence in schools, which again has another impact. Particularly, in the Metropolitan Police, they've scaled back considerably the Safer Schools partnership and some of the activities they did. So across the whole piece, it's quite varied, and there's much more, I think, around policing trying to stay in its lane a little bit around crime prevention. So back to Alex's point, that link and that causal link between crime and suspensions and expulsions or exclusions is really, really important, I think, for policing to understand, and then to really look around. So what then? What is our role then in that? Where do we sit?
And Alex, what does the evidence say about where police should sit, if it says anything, or it's open to interpretation? Can you just give us a bit of background on that?
Yeah, there's been some work on that. I mean, there's again, I haven't looked at the kind of police in schools literature very deeply. There has been some work about police as like credible messengers delivering interventions to help reduce other kinds of problem behaviour. In terms of like police officers in schools, there was a lot of resistance to it when they were first introduced kind of quite a few years ago. And I think, on to Simon's point, just very quickly, particularly at the Met, because I know about it, like there was a lot of pushback against the idea of withdrawing staff, police officers from schools, but it was what, 370 odd out of 24,000 officers, and those officers weren't pulled out and then not returned to schools. They became part of the local neighbourhood team. The question is, were they in the same neighbourhood is a different one, and so it wasn't like that skill or knowledge base disappears, but there's a chance it kind of moved around, and so you then lose the link between the school and the police service. To the other point, yeah, I mean, there has been a kind of move away from introducing police forces into schools in general in the UK, or in England and Wales, we should say, and there were alternatives previously. So when the police weren't going around in like doing the roundups, you then had education welfare officers who effectively were doing similar sorts of things, and you have charities doing the same thing as well. So the question is, should police be in schools? Well, schools are, to use a modern phrase, like a safe space for children to kind of make mistakes and learn from them. And there's a point at which, it's not clear what point at which, that should tip over into police being present in schools beyond them being called by the school. There is a point about normalizing contact with police and making that kind of less scary and so forth. But again, it's not really clear, like, where the right place for this is, what the Goldilocks zone is, and I would imagine that it will need to vary quite a lot depending on what the need is for a school. And indeed, some schools may be inviting police officers in for different reasons, whether it's about the job itself, or applying, or being a police officer, or actually delivering approaches. So that's a slightly waffly answer to a more specific question, Matt, but I hope that's interesting.
That's all good. It's all good, and I think we might return to this thought about like what might some tests look like, ethical tests in that zone, to sort of see what works, accepting it might be completely different in different areas. Just staying with you for a sec though, Alex. I mean, the evidence suggests, like, there's this correlation causation thing here is coming up straight away, but it suggests there's strong correlation between exclusion and then going on to commit serious violence later, be involved in serious violence later. But it's not a two-way relationship, is it? That street, it's not a two-way street. Do you want to just talk around the strength of that evidence and sort of where that comes from, just to set the scene? And then,
yeah,
I mean, Simon, just to cue you up, so you've got a second to think about it while Alex talks. If you're in a VRU or in a violence reduction space, what's the temptation there to see school exclusions as a pipeline of people to sort of work on prevention wise, and what's the sort of thinking around that at the moment? Well, I'll just start then, Alex, with the evidence.
Yeah, I mean, so as I said, school exclusion has been kind of listed as a risk factor, and suspension have been listed as risk factors for kind of future crime since at least the 1990s. I can remember a 1996 Home Office report that kind of looked at this. What's happened more recently, though, partly, and I've been involved in some of these studies, is to really try and focus on the causal relationship between exclusion and later criminality, which is devilishly difficult, for various reasons we can get into. But in doing that, the DFE have also kind of advanced a lot of what we understand by kind of using their own data. One of the key things they produced recently, I think it's 2022, was to look at the timing of suspensions relative to the first serious violence offence. And about 2/3 of suspensions happen about 1 to 2 years prior to the first serious violence offence. So the temporal ordering, the ordering in time makes sense, but it's quite a leap to say it was because of the exclusion that they then got the serious violence offence. The other thing to say is that when you look at studies in prisons, for example, or look at kids who get convicted of serious violence offences, quite a lot of them, I was just going to try and find the stat, it was about 70% I think, end up, of those who've already got a serious violence offence have some sort of were excluded in the past, but only about 6% of kids who get excluded go on to commit a serious violence offence. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, just pause a note. Does the causation thing matter from an operational perspective? This might segue into the question for Simon. You know, if you've got this high correlation between suspension, you've got 2 years arguably to work with the young person, the child, then should police be worrying about whether it's causal factor, or is that enough trail of breadcrumbs there for them to do something with operation?
I suppose it depends on the reason for exclusion. I mean, because obviously there's a lot of variety in that too. Like some kids will be excluded for criminal offences. You know, there's no question that those kids would be involved with the police in some way. What the actual kind of work is I don't really know the details on. But yeah, I mean, I think to go to the point that Simon's going to talk about, perhaps this idea of a pipeline doesn't really stand up that well. But if we're thinking about, well, we can kind of play the numbers and say, well, this school's got a very high suspension or exclusion rate, and a lot of those kids are getting excluded for these reasons that look around, you know, that may suggest there's some relationship to other kinds of crime happening nearby, then that might be the basis for the police to do more. But that would require kind of that relationship, but also it would require, you know, an analyst or a police officer really thinking about that problem very, very locally and saying that, you know, the other way of thinking about it is, well, what proportion of kids from what school have been in contact with the police? And that might tell you another thing about how to target like police intervention, but what that intervention looks like and is it the right thing to do? Again, are separate questions.
All right, stick a pin in that because I'm going to come back to that 2 seconds. Simon, tell us about the idea of this pipeline, what you're seeing the forces are doing nationally at the moment, and where the thinking is around that.
Absolutely, and I mean, again, picking up Alex's point, I mean that 6% is quite stark, isn't it? And I think that is a really important piece when we are dealing with partners and sort of third sector that are very strong and very vocal around not criminalising or involving young people into the police sphere, and that's a really important challenge. And what I mean by that is if only 6% of those people that are being excluded are involved in serious youth violence later, why would we then involve or engage that 94% onto police databases, into police contact and all those other reasons? So that's a real strong challenge back. But I think from a policing point of view, there's almost two elements to it really. I think to talk that through, which is the pre exclusion and the post exclusion, and I have forgotten top of my head where it is, but I think it's Hertfordshire. In Hertfordshire, that there's a situation where the school's officer was involved in the decision making panel, or certainly involved in a discussion around the exclusion of children. And I think, again, there's no evidence of this, but it just feels right. But again, no evidence, we can't really show it. But the reason for that was, you know, if we're going to exclude, you know, Dave, they would be called. The officer would then go back and get an intelligence package from a policing point of view around what they know about Dave, to be able to enhance and give some richness around. But you know, because we do know that the best place for children in school, for a whole variety of reasons, peer support, vulnerability, where they are, all these other 3 reasons, that's really the best place for them. The school may not know of those factors that the police do. So if they can inform them around these, it may change the exclusion. It might, you know, a nuanced decision will help them. But that seems the right thing to do. And then there's that post-event thing, which is if someone is excluded, should there be an automatic referral to the local police to say we've now excluded this child? Should they then be on the policing radar? There are no sort of consistent approaches to that. Again, it depends on your local relationship with that school. Some schools officers will automatically receive that information because they'll be part of that management team. They sit on the management meetings, so they're aware. They can then let the local neighbourhood officer know, or they can deal with it locally. Then the question is what do we do with that knowledge that someone has been excluded, and how do we deal with that? Which comes back to that thing around the information sharing. What is legitimate sharing of that information? And like Alex said, if someone is excluded but if someone is excluded for disruptive behaviour, is that a policing matter when 6% will later turn into serious youth violence? But then again, there are other areas that we could think through. So it's a very a very nuggety problem, isn't it? It's a real complex issue there.
Is there space for national guidance? Is there enough of a one set of principles that could apply to all here for there to be a national policy framework for it, or is it more of a localized issue? Let me go Simon and then Alex on that one, if I can.
Yeah. I think there is, and I think there is enough data, and I think there's certainly enough understanding of what are the risk factors in there. And like Alex mentioned, if someone has been excluded for violence, surely that has to be a risk factor then, doesn't it? And equally, they may well actually be under investigation for that violence anyway, so they'll be on the police radar. But I think there's certainly got to be some risk factors in there around certain behaviours which would raise that up and make it more of an discussion around what we then do with that. But I think there's absolutely got to be some framework around when does it become on the police radar to be involved with that.
Alex?
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, again, we haven't got it on the presentation, Matt, but like you can see, and to Gwen's point in the questions, I'm talking mainly about English schools. English and Welsh is education is devolved to other territories. One sec, sorry.
I think Alex he's either had a lawnmower going off. Is it lawnmower or Amazon delivery? What was it?
It was background noise right outside the door. So apologies. So the data I can see for Wales, Gwen, it's quite out of date. But yeah, we have just to finish that point, we have like on our doorstep effectively little tests of alternative policy regimes happening, which we couldn't just normally test out, I don't think, very easily. So Scotland, if memory serves, like almost got rid of the idea of exclusions and suspensions as an option. And there's been some discussions around, what that's meant for teachers and schools. So there is evidence out there on that. And then for Wales, I just plead ignorance. I haven't really looked at it in Wales, but we have these different approaches happening. And it's interesting to understand like what they show us, if they show us anything. To the point about localization, so in the DFE data that again we can circulate the link to it, what you see really is a really stark variation across England, just to be specific. And typically, if I was to say to people on the call, like, put in the chat where you think exclusions are highest in England, and then we'll see what they say. I think they can go ahead and do that if they want, and we can wait. And I think it's just worth having a think about it, because it's not always that intuitive. But also we have really good data on geographical variation down to the level of local authority, and then within local authorities we have really good information at the school level on where exclusions are highest. Now that might be because of a change in policy in the school that leads to increases in exclusions, and that's the work I've done with others around academisation, that you see increases in exclusions once schools became academies. But it might be that actually the school is dealing with like a quite hardened problem around like school disruption or school behaviour with the cohort of kids that attend the school, but we don't know from the outside what the real issue is. So I think there's a few things in there, but I think certainly it's unusual. We have a lot of data on this, so it's really good to have that. And I think it's a question of how that information is used. What I don't think it is a justification for police or any kind of external agencies to be kind of knocking on the door necessarily without a lot of consultation first around what's appropriate. Because as Simon said, the most appropriate resolution probably would be from the school first, and led by the school. Also to reduce the amount of kind of interagency kind of collaboration or overlap on things. I guess the other point of this is that underlying it, particularly around the point of violence, is the serious violence duty. And again, I don't know how much of that is being used to kind of think about this route into conversation, Simon, around like, how do schools and other agencies cooperate on this point. But it may be that actually the exclusion for a violent offence is a prompt for the conversation for police, or at least it's something that actually it should be happening anyway. I don't know. I haven't looked at that, what the duty requires there.
Okay, so I'm just going to you said something earlier about sort of the opportunity not almost to look at an individual case, but to look at schools where you've got exceptional rates of exclusion and that are correlated with exceptional rates of violence. For a question for both of you, to what extent is that happening, or to what extent have you seen that happening as normal practice? To what extent do you think there's mileage in there in terms of perhaps starting to look at which schools need to be worked with on a more systematic basis, or which areas of the country need to be looked at on a more systematic basis? I'll throw that question to you, and then I'm going to turn to some of the questions that are starting to stack up in the chat. And while I'm there, encourage people to put in where they think highest exclusions are in the country, so we can have a bit of a quiz on that. But yeah, first question. And please jump in, whoever wants to take it first. To what extent do we think there's a place-based approach to this issue that could or is being enacted?
Well, I think absolutely there is. I mean, I think thankfully that serious use violence is not widespread. It's not a national, and when you look at the data, it is obviously linked more around the metropolitan areas. That's where we get the real spikes in serious use violence. So I think there is something around, if we're targeting this intervention around the prevention of violence, which is an interesting point, because there is also the other elements in there. That I mean, when you look at the data which Alex has produced, there are also a number of exclusions for sexual behaviours. There's a number of exclusions for discriminatory behaviour, which might link more into perhaps the CT world. So there are other elements that we may consider from a whole system policing point of view of what would we like to do with that. If someone is excluded for sexual behaviours, should that be going into that side of policing as a indicator and for us to work on there? But I know we're here to talk a bit more around the violence area, but I think that localized and sort of more focused approach has absolutely got to be the way forward. If nothing else, demand. We don't have the resources and the demand to deal with all of it. Whilst the numbers of exclusions aren't large, I mean, I think it was 4,000 last year. I mean, that's not 11,000 last year. It's not huge numbers of people, but that's still a large number if you went through all of them to be assessed and to be put into the policing system and some type of response to be provided. And I don't think we have the ability to do that. So I think that the localism absolutely is important. And again, that ties into the local risk factors as well, doesn't it, around it? We know the risk factors are certainly high in certain areas. Even in London itself, for example, the risk factors are very different amongst London. There are certain areas where, that again could aggravate whether or not there needs a policing intervention.
Yeah, and just to come in on that, no one's put their guesses in the chat. I guess everyone's too worried. But like when I ask people, where do you think, if I show a map of England, where do you think suspensions and exclusions are highest? Nearly every time I've asked that question, someone says London. Actually, London has the lowest exclusions and suspension rates in the country. And which is again fairly counterintuitive, and so that also tells us that the link between suspensions and violence, or youth violence in particular, may not be as strong as we're led to believe, particularly if you're looking at area level, where there are pockets of high exclusions and high suspensions. Typically, the northeast has quite a lot relative to the rest of the country, and it moves around a bit with the southwest, like Bristol, Cornwall, but it depends on, there's like an issue of how many pupils there are. It's also worth keeping in mind there are 9 million pupils in schools. Most exclusions happen in secondary school, and if you've ever looked at the age crime curve, it follows really neatly that you see an increase in exclusions that kind of almost mirrors the increase in kind of crime and criminal activity by age group that you see at the same time. But Simon, to your point, yeah, there were about 11,000 permanent exclusions, but there were nearly 1 million suspensions last year. So if you think about that as a risk factor, as a population level, nearly 1 in 9 on average pupils were suspended last year, and that's increased enormously from even the year before. and we're now at like levels that are kind of popping up. I'm just looking at the stats. It's a 21% increase from the previous year. There were only 787,000 suspensions last year, and we're now pushing 1 million this year. And that's the bigger problem, frankly, because with permanent exclusions, schools face a financial penalty. They lose the money. The money goes with the kid. They lose the money associated with that pupil, which is only right and fair. And that's why there was this idea about off-rolling or keeping kids like on the books but out of school, which is not okay, because the school's being paid to provide education. So in terms of like the risk, like we have actually something which is happening a lot as a policy, and apart from education wonks and people who work in education systems, they are kind of very, very concerned about that increase, and certainly DFE is too. Link to the
Amazing.
data. Someone's asking for it. 1 second.
Yeah, that's amazing. We will definitely, after we finished up today, we will get a sheet out with links to all the data, and I've got to start I think a series of EBP bingo, because you've got in early with age crime curve there, Alex, and I'll get some details out about that as well, so people can follow up on what that is. I had a question in my mind. That's quite a mad statistic, isn't it? 1 in 9 children. I mean, it's not 1 in 9, because you're going to have repeats in there as well, but that's pretty striking. So Natalie, who is Serious Violence Duty Analytical Lead from Norfolk, shout out for Norfolk, where I used to work. On the point around 70% of children with a conviction having been excluded, do you feel there are any other risk factors that are closely associated with this that could lean more towards causation? Alex, I can tell you, Alex will never answer that, because that's way too inferential. But I'll go on, Alex. I'll throw it to you in the first.
No. Oh, sorry. I was getting distracted. I was reading Susie's question about the data. Susie, I'll reply. But basically, what you posted in the chat and were querying is that that's the latest release, which is only the last term's worth of complete data. So you need to multiply the numbers by 3, and that'll give you 1 million, because it's 335,671 in the autumn term of 24-25. Here we go. Okay. Sorry, Matt. The question about causation and stuff. What was the question? I just have to.
Risk. So the question was around risk factors. So on the point around 70% of children with a conviction having been excluded, are there other risk factors that could be closely associated with that might tip the scales towards causation?
Yeah. Well, I guess that's part of the issue, is that kids who get excluded may have other behavioural problems at the same time. And this point about causation, what we often don't know, and what the data does suggest, is that behavioural problems, certainly in terms of leading to a suspension, tend to occur before, say, a serious violence offence is detected or committed, detected, and prosecuted. What we don't know is, like, actually, is there other things that are happening that aren't in the official data, because a lot of this is official data, because it might be that let's imagine like an extreme. A kid's got a kind of a disposition to be violent and aggressive, and they're violent and aggressive in every environment, at home, at school, out in the street, and they end up getting loads of suspensions, loads of exclusions, moving between different kind of education providers. They end up in court, they end up in prison, and so forth. It isn't because of the exclusion that they've ended up being violent. They were already that way. The other extreme is a kid who, gets excluded once and is never violent ever again, even if they get into a fight at school. So we have that extreme. And by the way, most kids are suspended for between 1 and 2 days if they're suspended, and most of them are suspended once or twice in a given year, and that's kind of it. But there are some kids who are getting suspended 40 times in a year. And there's a huge chunk, there's a few thousand kids, as you said, Matt, there are a few thousand kids that get multiple suspensions. So there is an obvious place for intervention, not necessarily from police, but certainly, some sort of individual multi-agency approach, because each time that's happening, it's a response to behaviour. It isn't like the schools arbitrarily decide to suspend kids. The heads are accountable for this decision. They get put to their feet put to the fire by governors about these things, and by the people as well. So they don't take the decision lightly. And typically there's like probably internal processes that were not in the official data that would show us more about the trajectory of a kid's disciplinary trajectory within schools. And that's the missing piece of the puzzle at the moment, really. and I'll answer the question. Sorry, rambling on. The wider risk factors, yes, but the issue with risk factors is that we end up focusing on things that are symptoms and not causes, and that's partly what we're trying to get at with some of this work, is to understand really what is really going on that leads to the behaviour that then leads to the punishment of suspension and exclusion happening. And so we are trying to kind of move away from kind of general risk factor stuff, unless you want to do prediction, but in that case, fill your boots, you can put in loads of different things, and that is one thing that isn't being done as far as we know. There isn't much work happening around the prediction of the risk of exclusion and suspension. Again, there's you then veer very quickly into policing type debates around stop search, because you have kind of fairly maintained levels of difference between ethnic groups in terms of their risk of suspension and exclusion. So again, like, there's loads of things to unpick with it, but there are some areas where we're very clear what a risk factor is, but we're also clear that it's not a real thing. Like, it's not because of the kid's skin color necessarily that this is happening, but there are things that are happening to them that look on the data, the raw data, that it's kind of unequal. So there's a lot of stuff to unpack in that, but I'll shut up and let someone else ask the question.
No, that's great. I mean, it kind of leads into Victoria. Hi, Victoria. Nice to see you again. Her point around sharing information sometimes with schools, which is then used actually to support the case for exclusion. I don't know, Simon, if that's something that's come up nationally as sort of repeated issue, and what the possible workarounds are around that, because that's quite gnarly.
It is, and again, I think that sort of goes back to the point I made earlier around, that some of the challenges around that is that you may be dealing with perhaps a one or two incidents in the school. Then if you then have your your expulsion information sharing meeting, and the police then come and say, well, actually, we are investigating them for this, and this, it then may influence the head around, that's not the type of individual I want in my school. But the fact is they haven't displayed those behaviours, or they're unaware of those behaviours in the school. So you're absolutely right, there is a risk of that and obviously, and particularly from a policing point of view, that many of these matters do get NFA'd. It's not as if they're actually proven. Many can be just intelligence and because of that. So it really is an issue around making sure that we share the right data, make sure the provenance of that and how it's shared as well, and how it's used by the school to make those decisions. And picking on the point Alex made, absolutely in no way, shape or form is this an attack on the schools or bashing the schools. And they've incredibly difficult job. They've got to safeguard all the other children. They've got to maintain levels of education. It's a really difficult decision, not one they take lightly. It's not a sort of as soon as someone steps out of line, they are out of the school because they're disruptive. It really is seen as a last sort of resort. But it is a very difficult thing. What is the police's role in that? Should we even be sharing information at all around that? Is it of any relevance to them at all? Unless it's perhaps relevant to, we make a decision that is safeguarding, or we make a decision that's relevant to what the matter is. And that's some of the sort of framework and judgment that individual officer would have to make on the ground. And I say that's a difficult one. If you withhold it and then something happens, you may well rightly be criticised that you didn't mention they were under investigation for sexual offence and they've now committed one in the school. Had you told me that, I would have safeguarded the children. But you might argue, well, the actual matter for expulsion was a race matter, nothing to do with sex matter. So there was no need for me to disclose that. It's all those difficulties around that, and there's nothing out there at the moment to sort of steer police or schools through that.
Okay, Alex, for officers faced with that challenge, then sort of day to day, what is the evidence they really need to get up to speed with to make informed decisions, or does it even exist? Is there evidence out there they should be looking up as a matter of course to help guide those decisions?
I mean, there isn't, as far as I'm aware, there isn't, because we're talking about different things here. So one is like individual case decisions, of which I don't know if there is evidence out there on that. I've never looked for it. I think that would be a completely kind of different type of evidence that officers would need. And maybe, Simon, the guidance is around what to disclose and under what circumstances. Maybe that's where the NPCC comes in to say, it has to be specific, or it has to be done, you do it by default as a duty. because the other side of this is that moving away from the individual stuff, a lot of the stuff I have looked at or look at is at the data in aggregate and kind of what that tells us, and they're very different things. So a lot of the evidence we have is typically around like aggregated data on groups and so forth, but very little of it, barring really good quality research on the experience of being excluded or deciding to exclude somebody, which is out there. I think that sort of work may be useful, but I don't think it would be any different from what Simon has talked about, kind of the experiential learning officers have through engaging in schools around these difficult decisions. So it is really like, what is the evidence base? What would be most useful for policing, I suppose? But the other side of it is like, what would be most useful for schools? Would school leaders, who have to make these calls, want to know like about this stuff by default, and if they do, how do you do that in a way that is kind of proportionate and systematic without it becoming being interpreted as like fishing expeditions or prejudicial in some way in some factor. So and I suppose the other side of it, final point of it, is that we're talking about police and education system. There's obviously children's services too, who are a central player in this, and there may be a point that actually the coordination angle of that is where children's services would come in, rather than it being police to schools directly. I don't know, again, that comes down to kind of the local agency cooperation. One thing I would say, by the way, on the stats is that up until about 2021, 22, and for decades before that, about 90% of exclusions and suspensions were for males. That figure has now dropped to around 60%. So it's a really big jump in like a short space of time. One explanation given, which I don't really buy, is that there was a switch between using biological sex and gender as the kind of basis for that information. I just don't think it's plausible that would result in such a big change. And so there's something happening around like disciplinary action in schools that has shifted from extreme like male orientation, male punishment, to bringing 60%, nearly 50, coming to 50-50 in terms of males and females, which I think is at the moment is really not understood well at all, as far as I can tell. That's that's only from 23, 24, so very, very recent data. Again, that also suggests perhaps a different response might be needed, depending on the nature of the reasons for exclusions, which again, I've asked DFE for, like a breakdown of male versus female reasons for exclusions. I couldn't find it in the data.
Cool. Okay. Susie has been on a little roll here, so I just want to sweep up some of her points because she's looking at trying to get more information to help build a picture, I think is my summary of this. And of course, there's a good flag here around the new guidance for knife possession offences, which is a couple of weeks away. And I mean, this interesting view around this is going to sort of end up with the criminalisation of more children and potentially be another obstacle to information sharing. So just on the subject of information sharing, Simon, I've just come to you on this one first because I suspect this comes up a few times on the portfolio. What should forces do about this? What is there anything new to do, or again, is this just about navigating the local landscape with the individuals you're working with? What's your thinking there?
I mean, it is a very complex landscape, and I don't move away from that. And there's there's various duties that are applied, and there is no sort of one size fits all. I think the key to that is that real local, and again, that doesn't help now with the rise of academies and the sort of less local authority. At one point you just dealt with one local authority and you moved on. The information sharing is very difficult. It's not easy, but I think the general thing is we should dare to share. I know that's the phrase that we use, and we do need to share this information. We are professionals, and it should be done in the right way, and to do that. It is. I just think it's around us trying to understand where we get the most bang for our buck for that information sharing, and that's the really sort of crucial bit for me that we need to do. And I think there's also just, I mentioned earlier, but the truancy bit is also just as important to me as the exclusion, the suspension bit, because the truancy bit, you just drop off the radar. They just don't bother going to school anymore. And so you're just as vulnerable, you're just as likely to be involved in activities that are not good for a child if you're truanting as well as if you're actually forcibly removed from the school. So I think that's two sides of the same coin, really, is that and the truancy one is almost less visible, I think, because of all the levels of scrutiny and the levels of data that's collected around exclusions and suspensions. The truancy is not. It's just a sort of an uncomfortable thing that sort of sits there that doesn't really get into. I think they both need to be looked at with the same vigor and the same sort of insight around that, because if you just don't go to school anymore, then you just really are, you tend to sort of drop off the radar slightly a little bit. So I think that's really important on both sides.
Okay, that's brilliant. Alex, obviously you worked in the policing space and the academic space. Any magic tricks around information sharing?
Based on like work between like government departments, it's like being clear about the rationale for it and the motivation, almost like the values underpinning the idea of the share in the first place. It's not about doing your duty. It's like trying to kind of fulfill your role and protect children and protect the school and so forth. But I think it's really about specificity. Like it has to be very, very clear, like what the why. Does that become a blanket case for data sharing? Well, in the case of, say, violence reduction units, I mean, I think Thames Valley is one example where they had very good data sharing with Children's Services Local Authority. And so there may be a model there for how to do this to kind of build a picture of risk. Again, I don't think it's at the individual level in terms of they're not talking about Alex Sutherland in this address, but they are saying like, here's like a risk profile for this area, perhaps. Or, again, I don't know, but I think TVP did a fair bit of work in that area over many years. And so there may be something around that that's worth investigating. I also was thinking about this point about truancy and like, not attending school, absence from school, however defined. There was work in Estonia around like predicting this again, to try and think about how to identify it early. One of the points I make around the presentations on exclusions is if we're waiting for until we get to the point of decision making around whether to exclude or not, we are very, very late in the process. There are still things you could look at, you could try and test out at that point, but we are much better off going upstream of that point in time. And particularly, there is a debate around like, should schools be allowed to exclude at all, like following the Scottish model? When Teacher Tap, who's I think SCBP should try to mirror this, which is basically you've got 10,000 teachers who are asked 3 short questions pretty much every day. And so you have this enormous quantity of like frontline practice responses to questions around should schools be able to exclude, yes or no, or ever be able to do it? And you see that very strongly teachers and head teachers in particular disagree with the idea that schools should not be able to exclude or suspend. Like they view it as like a power they need to kind of help them run the schools. That is interesting. But again, that is the sort of thing that education has got, but I don't think necessarily policing has got as frequently. But this idea of looking earlier on in the process, I think that is actually really important. And again, we could be thinking about risk factors, identification and so forth. And that is where the multi-agency data might come in, because it then helps you triangulate, well, actually, this kid's got loads of problems at home, but they're not exhibiting this issue at school because kids may behave very, very differently depending on where the context is. And so actually we could think about, well, maybe we can provide extra academic support for the kid at school, and the home stuff we do, we do via social children's services and so forth. So there is that kind of ability to do that. Doing that well and carefully and proportionately, I think, is important. And yeah, you have to kind of think about what really matters is keeping the kids at school in education of some sort and making sure they're safe. And so it's thinking about those, I guess, as the guiding principles for conversations around data sharing, as well as the other side of it, which is like keeping the schools safe and other people safe, which is also part of the conversation around exclusions as a policy. Because there is an idea that the reason you're doing it is for the other kids in the class. The evidence really isn't there to support that at the moment. And then maybe actually there's contrary evidence emerging that the kids in the classes where kids are excluded may perform worse academically than in situations where it doesn't happen. So it isn't like a really clear-cut picture, but it seems like we're now at the point of challenging lots, or at least assessing some of the main arguments for and against exclusions as a policy. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, that's cool. So in a moment, I'm going to ask you, as we just round this session out, on what your wish list, both of you individually, would be around what research needs to be done next in this field. So I'm going to ask you another question in the intervening period, so I'll just plant that seed and come back to it. Heather asks a very very good question that sort of brings us to the point, I guess, of this session. Are there any positive, strong examples of what's worked in terms of partnership approaches to reducing school exclusions in areas where it has been previously particularly problematic? So yeah, Alex, do you want to start on that, or well, let me throw it open. Either of you
I can go
jump in.
quickly and briefly just to finish. So there isn't much evidence. Again, the only evidence I think will be coming is around the introduction of behaviour hubs, which I don't know what the evaluation of that looks like or how good it is, but it's out there. That was the idea of like having like training for schools. But what we know from reviewing the evidence on like how to reduce exclusions and suspensions, or actually more accurately how to reduce the behaviour that leads to those things, the four main areas: like enhancing the academic skills of the pupils, the kids, counselling for those that need it, targeted, mentoring, monitoring of pupils, like child to adult kind of positive relationships that kind of help the kids manage the school situation, manage their home life potentially, and then skills training for teachers. One of the things that I was astonished by is that initial teacher training may only have like a day or a week on behaviour management. And so you are, a brand spanking new teacher, and you're then thrown into, depending on where you are, schools with potentially very challenging kids who aren't that much younger than you, and you're then supposed to kind of be in charge of them, quote unquote. So I think there's something in that hasn't been done that could be looked at. And yeah, I'll stop there and let Simon come in.
Right, Simon.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, again, interesting. The four elements that Alex mentioned, policing have very little to do with those from a policing point of view. We don't counsel, we can't assist with academic work, and I think that's the challenge for policing: is where do we fit into that picture? Where can we add some value? They are the things that work. They are the activities and the behaviours that will reduce the numbers of expulsions, which we think would help policing in the long term, because the evidence we've shown that we don't want children excluded. That's the best place for them. But where is that police role? And I think that's where can we add that value? So there's those two roles, isn't there? Is what can police do to assist with children, prevent them from being excluded, and then it's the post event, which is when that exclusion does happen, what is the policing role there? Where should we intervene? Where should we be stepping in? And again, like Alex said, just because you've been excluded doesn't mean you should probably get a knock on the door from the local beat officer, or should it? Should there be some actual support put around you to say that actually, yes, you're now out of that that safety bubble of the school, and somebody, whether that's policing is a discussion, but somebody in the state now has to put some support and level around you. If that doesn't happen, then it does become a policing problem, because we know that whether it's 18 months or 2 years down the route, they will then come absolutely into our sphere of influence, as an arrest, as in first time entrance. So it's just a matter really of how much do we sort of veer out of our lane in that preventative piece, or is that children's services? Is that somebody else's role? Which again, we are supportive in that, and that's always the problem, isn't it? Is where the resources are, where the lines are.
Okay.
Yeah, and there's something in that very quickly around. I mean, it's like jargon of the month. The idea of like teachable moments has been like looked at, tested out once, I think, in one study that LSE did. But it is like flavour of the month or flavour of the decade so far. Who knows? But it's one of those things that just hasn't really been studied in great depth, and we don't know whether that contact with police following, say, a suspension or exclusion would be beneficial or not. And what do we mean by beneficial? If we're thinking about, does it prevent future crime, that's very different from does it prevent future exclusions or behavior problems. A key missing part of the puzzle, as I mentioned, is the fact that these kids don't just pop out of nowhere and get excluded. There's typically an internal trajectory that some of them are following that we can then think about, well, actually, this is that information, particularly now you have multi-academy trusts that are running many schools with hundreds of thousands of kids in. You've got a lot of information inside the schools that you could use to think about, can we work out like who is most likely to have behavior problems down the line, or we should think about intervening with earlier. Again, it's never too early, it's never too late, as the late great David Farrington said, but like we can be at the moment, a lot of it's thinking about the after, and we should be thinking about the before side of it too.
Yeah, okay, that's brilliant. Right, let's close this out then. Give me your 1-2 things in terms of your research wish list in this space, and you can be as specific as you dare be. What kind of studies do you want to see done next?
Me or Simon? You want to go first, Simon?
Okay, I'll go. From a policing point of view, we would like to obviously have loads of data if we could, loads of evidence. But I think the two sort of things that we would like to explore more really is that risk factor element of where can we show causation, can we show correlation, can we show just a link? What are the areas of which behaviours data would give us some route for which we can at least target police resources and demand in there? Just something would give us a steer. If we can say, I don't know, if it's more likely that if it happens in year 11 and it's this type of behaviour and it's just before the exams, then you probably are more likely to have to put some intervention at that point, because that would lead you to more likely to a youth violence situation. That's really, really helpful for us. And then the second thing is a research piece, because it is around what works, but it's around, having said all that, what is the role of the police here? What is our job? And I say, is it knocking on doors? Is it supporting? Is it taking positive action? Is it actually applying for orders? What actually works from a policing point of view? Because as we said, so many of these things are pastoral, they're academic, they're social welfare. That's not our area of business. And so we would then need to understand that even if we did know what factors are going to lead towards criminality, are we the right agency to intervene at that point? And maybe we are. We just don't have that understanding at the moment around what we should be doing.
It's about 10 years worth of work. That's brilliant. Thanks, Simon. Alex, with that, bring us home.
Just to say, if NPCC said to DFE, please do some work on risk factors for prediction of exclusion, I'm pretty certain you would get that from them. So I will follow up with you on that point.
Yep.
Yeah, I think you could also think about asking Teacher Tap to ask teachers and school leaders, where do they think the role of police should be? Like, thinking about what options, what should it be? Again, getting feedback from the front line, I think, is really important, because you need the teachers to find whatever the police are doing acceptable, and not just like on an ad hoc individual basis. Types of research, I would love to see a big test of restorative practice. It is something that has a lot of ad hoc evidence around it. There's some evidence from the US, but they're tiny studies, because it's something that is presented. It's been transplanted from criminal justice into school. The idea that you can kind of repair harms and reduce kind of sanctions and so forth, but there's like an industry around it, but there isn't really any evidence to support its effectiveness. I think also extremely boring suggestion for research, which is happening, which is good, just letting everyone know, is that in criminal justice, we have a unit cost study happening every few years to say how much does each homicide or robbery cost in terms of both socioeconomic cost to the society. We don't have similar in education for exclusions. If we did, it would mean our conversations around what we should test out come with a price tag. Like, if it's cheaper than what we currently do, it's worth testing out. And that's actually something that would be fantastically useful for this area, because even things that are quite heavily involved, like complex human service delivery, one-to-one with kids, if it turns out that's cheaper than an exclusion or the on cost from policing, then it's worth trying it out, certainly. Being bold and brave on testing stuff out is important. The other thing I'd say, third thing, sorry, is initial classroom behaviour management training for teachers with follow-ups, reminders, and so forth. I think we've got a lot of stuff we can do now, particularly with modern technology, that we can do quite easy kind of follow-ups to allow them to kind of remind them of good practice and what good practice looks like and the stuff they've been trained on, and to kind of look at the training itself and see how effective it is or isn't.
Amazing. I mean, we've covered so much ground in that hour. That's been really fascinating for me, and I know the numbers that have stayed online have really stuck. So I think the audience has been really engaged, or wandered off and just left their teams running. But either way, the stats look good. So we'll okay with that. I just want to say thank you to Alex and Simon for your contributions, and to everybody who asked questions. We will, please do send any follow-up questions through to us on email. Or stick them in the chat now. We will send some briefing notes along with a sort of AI garbled version of the transcript around to everybody, and some video clips will be uploaded onto our website too. I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their afternoon. Simon and Alex, if you just want to stay where you are for 2 seconds. Thank you. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks all.
Thank you, everyone.